Hey guys, my name is Colson Rosa, and welcome back to Seraphim Stories. So today I want to talk to you guys about build-up, and this is the first section of the 3-act structure of a story that includes build-up, climax, and resolution. So I want to talk sort of about the first third of your book, approximately. Now it doesn't have to be exactly 1/3. Some genres focus more on the build-up, some more on the climax, and some more on the resolution. But I want to focus on, generally speaking, the first third of your book and what some of the goals should be in this section of your writing as you lead up toward the climax. So the first thing that the build-up should try to do is it should introduce the setting. World building needs to take place at the start of your novel to explain the type of setting and situation the characters find themselves in. You need to introduce the time period, at least generally speaking, to let your reader know what to expect from this type of story. This can be both large scale, talking about the overall setting, and then immediate with the personal location that the main character finds him or herself in. So in introducing the setting, you want to give some description of the world or the specific geographical location that the characters find themselves in to sort of set the mood and give a clear definition to the story so it feels like it's not just floating out in the middle of nowhere, but it's set in a specific place and time. You also then want to establish characters and backstory. So we need to know as a reader, who is this person? Who is this main character? Where are they from? What do they want and need out of life? What makes them unique? Why should the reader care about them? These are all very important questions that need to be answered in the first third of your book as this build-up seeks to not only introduce the character, but give some stakes behind the character, give some relatability behind the character. All of those aspects that I talked about in my character video, the groundwork needs to be laid at the very start. It's very tough for a book to not get its reader falling in love with the character at the start and then try to do that in the middle. You want your readers feeling for these characters, recognizing the struggles that they have, the difficulties that they face, recognizing what their current situation is in life, what some of their goals are in life as well. So the third thing that the build-up needs to do is it needs to introduce the problems. Of course, every story is going to have problems, whether big or small, but these challenges and difficulties feel very real to the prominent characters, both the protagonist and the antagonist, as well as a lot of the side characters. And it shouldn't take till halfway into the book for this problem to get introduced. It needs to be introduced rather quickly, because that then sets the stakes for the whole rest of the story. What the entire purpose of the story is and why it's even being told in the first place. Something has to go wrong. And it could start out with something small going wrong, and then it could lead to something much worse happening. But at the very least, there needs to be some kind of emotional, spiritual, physical, or situational stakes set from the very beginning to help the reader recognize this is why this story is being told, because this is the important moments that need to be addressed, the important challenges that then come with them. The next thing that needs to be done in the build-up is it needs to set the themes and the tone. Now, I'll be doing a video later on about themes more specifically, but there's a lot of themes that an author can pull from. Light versus dark, good versus evil, that's a common trope that we see, but also a very powerful and recognizable theme. The theme can be anything from love and hatred, to greed, to despair, to hope. So many different themes that can be pulled on. So many different prominent ideas that are addressed, and the worldviews of these characters are even challenged to say, are they going to stand by their worldview on this issue? Are they going to change it? Are they going to abandon it altogether? And the tone also is set. It needs to be laying the groundwork early to then set the tone for the entire book or the entire series. Now, the tone is the manner of the author's writing, sort of the author's style or personal flavor that they put into the book. No two authors are going to be exactly alike. Although you should learn many wonderful things from the authors that you read, you should not necessarily try to copy them word for word or sentence for sentence. Different authors will do things that you can respect, but you don't necessarily have to try to search and find a way to do everything that they do for their tone and make it your tone. You should have a unique tone in some perspective, because you're a unique person who's lived their own lives in their own context of the world that they have been placed in. I cannot write the same story that you can write. Now, we could write very similar stories, taking a lot of these truths about how to write a great novel. But even then, though our stories would be similar, they will have different nuances, and that's okay. Different intricacies of what you feel the characters would feel important to talk about. Little details you might notice that other people might not notice. Little things you would describe that I would never think to describe, and vice versa. So the tone is the different sort of flavorings or seasonings you put on your writing, the way that you express yourself in your own creative and unique manner. Now, you also don't need to worry too much about desperately panicking to try to find your own tone, trying so hard to make yourself unique that you're afraid you're never going to stand out. Of course, there are ways to make yourself unique and to stand out, and those are very important. But at the same point in time, naturally, just because of who you are, you will have some unique elements and attributes in your writing. And I think those should be embraced, not harmed. Because if you try to write a story that has absolutely no tone, it's going to be very dry, very boring, very bland, almost like a textbook. Now, the next thing I want to talk about with the build-up is how it needs to start the plot. The plot doesn't need to begin long down the road into your story. The plot needs to start toward the beginning. Even if the plot starts slowly, as it does in some cases, or even if the plot starts very quickly, as it does in a lot of the Narnia books that I am now reviewing by C.S. Lewis, we come to recognize that the groundwork for the plot starts almost always in the first chapter, as a lot of these things that I've been talking about need to start in the first chapter. Of course, they will then be built upon. They will then be improved and increased the longer you go on in this book that you're writing. But these things in the build-up most often are going to start in the first or second chapter. And that's important. Now, you need to then lay out, okay, this is how I want the characters to start in the first chapter, and I want them to be introduced. This is how I want the setting to be introduced, the problems to be introduced, some major overarching themes, some elements of the plot that are then going to begin. And I know that sounds like a lot to cram into the first chapter. But the good news is that you don't have to go into incredible detail necessarily in the first chapter on those issues. You could think of novels like The Old Man in the Sea or Moby Dick, where from the very beginning, not only are the fishermen introduced, but the problem that they're struggling in their industry is introduced, and they set sail looking for and striving for that massive catch that's going to change their lives. And of course, all of this is then set in the greater context of the world that these fishermen are living in. And you can see then that it's not necessarily hard to introduce all of these things, even as early as the first chapter. Now, don't be content just to start these things in the first chapter. Keep building upon these ideas. Don't just mention a problem and then take 10 chapters and get back to that problem later. The problem is integral to everything the characters are trying to solve. Don't just set a theme at the very start and then only return to the theme at the very end of the book. It should be woven throughout the story. And I think it can be done naturally and effectively no matter what type of beginning you're going for. And this is the next thing I want to talk about with the build-up, is different types of beginnings. Now, I think all of these beginnings can do the things that I have just mentioned, can do the things that I've talked about. Some of them might have easier times doing it than others, but overall, I just think some of these beginnings have different focuses, different things they're really trying to stress. But even if you're really trying to stress one thing, don't forget about the others. Don't become so character focused that you never introduce the world and never introduce the plot. Don't become so storyline focused that the characters feel like cardboard cutouts that could be the exact same as every other character in your story or every other character the reader has ever heard of before. So let's talk about some of these types of beginnings. The first is gradual. It's an easy intro to all of the world that you see. It starts out slowly. It starts out wanting to sort of do all of these things, but not rush the reader into them. This will be a type of situation where the first two chapters or couple of chapters are sometimes much longer. Or even if the chapters are shorter, there's many more chapters devoted to the start of this entire adventure. They want to go into a lot of detail on the setting, go into a lot of backstory on the characters, introduce the problem, talk about why it's a problem, talk about how much it's going to take to fix it, talk about where the entire story is going. Now, this can be a great intro because it doesn't leave anything to fall through the cracks. It takes its time. But this intro also needs to be careful not to drag itself too long or be boring, but it needs to make each of those elements not just well described, because taking a lot of time to describe it, but also interesting and captivating. And the more you learn, you just want to keep learning more. Now, this intro is very different from the next type, which is immediate action. Like I've talked about before, there are some stories that will almost immediately start you into the plot. You may not even know who the characters are or what the setting is yet, but the plot is beginning. The problems are already there from the start. Now, this can be very realistic because in life we don't always get to see the entire backstory leading up to a certain situation. Sometimes we're dropped right into the middle of a crisis and need to figure out what's going on from there. These action-packed starts can be very interesting because they get us excited right from the very beginning. But they also can lose a reader if you don't then, after this sudden start to the action begins, go back and develop who the characters are, what the setting is, why this problem was happening. Because you don't just need to know that a problem occurs, but you want to know why the problem occurred and what's going to be done to fix it. So the next type of intro is then a character piece. This is an intro that focuses very specifically on one character. What is their life like? What are their quirks? What are their oddities? What do they spend their time doing? How are their relationships with their family or friends? How is their perspective on their work? How is their perspective maybe on their kids or on their neighborhood or on a lot of these different things? It takes one character and doesn't want this character to feel flat in any way. It wants this character to feel so real that it's like a living, breathing person that you've met, or somebody that you could easily see yourself meeting and talking to. Now, this intro is great to build a protagonist or antagonist who's memorable, who feels very lifelike. But it also needs to remember that there's more to a story just than characters. And if those other problems aren't introduced, and they are introduced in a way that matters to the character, it will feel strange. So you want to show not just the character, but you want to show the character and how the setting relates to that character. The problem and how the character feels about that problem, how it relates to him. The themes and the tone and how they then impact that character, the plot that that character is going to be going on. If you take that approach, deeply developing a character then you can use that deeply developed character to shed light on all of those other things that I said are vastly important. So the last type of intro that I want to mention today is a setting piece. It does a very similar thing that I just talked about with the characters, but instead does it with the setting. It looks at potentially the government, potentially the economy, potentially the culture, the language, the world, socioeconomic status, a lot of different factors of the culture, some of the history of the culture, some of the lore of the culture. It goes very deep into this world that has been created. And when I'm talking about these types of intros, I'm not just talking about the first chapter. I'm talking about the general overall approach to the start of the book before we start heading much more deeply into the actions of the plot. Because remember, all of these things that have been done are leading up to and going through the plot. The actions that take place in the beginning of the journey are eventually leading toward that climax. This beginning set of actions is not less important, and these trials are not less important, but they are headed on a trajectory toward the climax, and that plot is what readers want to be hearing about, just as much as the characters and the setting themselves. Without a plot, a story's never moving forward, so it can't be forgotten about even in the building up phase of a story. So the last thing I want to talk about with this building up phase is the goals that you should keep in the back of your mind when writing this section. The first is to bond the reader with the character and have them root for the character. That's incredibly important. We love to root for underdogs, but even if it's not an underdog, we want a character that can be bonded with, or at least has deep emotions felt about that character. If it's more of an anti-hero or an antagonist introduced first, make the reader wrestle with and think through, why do I not like this character? What is this character doing wrong? Where's the hero that I'm longing to see? So the bond is still made there, even if it's a different type of bond than you would make with a hero. The next goal you should have in mind is investment in the world. You need to invest as an author in setting the overall picture of this world, even if it's one some people are familiar with. Assume your reader's not familiar with it and introduce them to this world. Furthermore, you want your reader to be invested in this world. You want your reader to be invested in 19th century London, or in 2nd century Mesopotamia, or in 4th century China. You want your reader to be invested in this setting, imagining themselves in this setting, wondering what would their life have been like if they were in this setting. And not just this broad setting that they can't really picture, but at least enough detail that there are some specifics they can latch onto. The next goal you should have should be shock or intrigue. The start of a book needs to catch the reader's attention, needs to hook them, bring them in. And this can be done through shocking the reader or through making them very curious about what's going to be happening next. And I've already mentioned in some of my other videos some ways to do this, but I'll talk more about this in the future. But having that problem that needs to be solved, having a character that's lifelike and stands out, those are some great ways to enact that process. And also economy of words, not dragging on and on and on, but hooking them in with vivid descriptions that really set the mood, really set the tone, and they can't look away. You can almost imagine your book as if it was a movie, and you would have to wonder, is this scene important, or is this one you would kind of look away from, maybe go get more popcorn or go on a bathroom break? You don't want that, especially at the start of your movie where you're trying to get them interested on the entire rest of the movie to come. In the same way, you don't want that with a book. You want the book to be shocking or mysterious and intriguing or exciting and inspirational. And then the reader will dive much deeper into the rest of the book. Another goal is you want the reader to feel the weight of the problem. Even if it's a problem that wouldn't affect them very much, it's a problem that feels weighty because it feels weighty to the setting. Maybe it's dragging down the world around it, or it's a problem that feels very weighty to the character. Something the character has decided, my life won't be the way I want it to be if I don't get this. That's something that then matters, because it shows that this book isn't of a normal day, it's of one of the most important days or time periods ever for that character. You also want to give your reader a general feeling for your writing style. You don't want to begin the book with one style and then suddenly completely change it and overthrow their entire expectations of what they thought was coming. You set the style, set the themes, set the tone. You can introduce more themes as the story goes along, but usually those themes will tie into the original themes presented at the beginning of the book. And last but not least, you want to advance the story. You want the story moving forward in the right direction and headed toward that epic climax. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope this really encouraged and inspired you to write an amazing beginning to your story. I hope you comment any questions or concerns you have, or maybe how excited you were when you first started your book. And I hope that you like this video and maybe consider subscribing. Thank you guys so much. Have a great day. God bless.